الانفجار الثاني وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، ربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today I'm here with Alex Gendler, a friend of mine for a few years now, and an ad hoc Ukrainian specialist due to his background. So, Alex, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, hey, great to be back. I mean, not great under these circumstances, but good to see you again, regardless. Yeah, so I was born in Kharkiv in Soviet Ukraine. That's the city in the northeast that's now being like flattened by artillery strikes. I am a Russian-speaking Jew from Kharkiv, and I went to 2 years of Soviet school before we left right during the collapse. So yeah, now I'm here in Brooklyn. I'm a freelance writer, editor, various things. And yeah, now everyone wants to know about Ukraine.
Yeah. I've been following the situation now for about, it feels like 20 years, actually. It's one of those things where, like the Afghanistan war or any number of other things that we see that come up regularly in the news, that those of us who have followed international politics have like low-key followed, but kind of not in enough detail for a long time. I mean, I'm talking going all the way back to the Yushchenko-Yanukovych election in like 2004, right before the Orange Revolution.
Right.
But there's some key facts that, I didn't realize until very recently. One is that of the post-Eastern Bloc countries, Ukraine's been the one who's been shut out of any return to normalcy, even by Soviet Bloc standards.
Yeah, Adam Tooze pointed that out, right? He had a good chart book on that, right?
Yeah, why is that? Why has Ukraine been on the short end of the stick as far as like, I mean, we wouldn't expect it to be the Czech Republic, but it really seems like it's not. It hasn't even been able to get to the lofty economic redevelopment of Belarus. So
yeah, I mean, Belarus is a special case because they didn't really dismantle any of their Soviet infrastructure, whether physically or politically. So Belarus was yeah, and I mean there was a good like long article about that maybe like a year and a half ago before like the protests started. But for a while it was Moldova that was the poorest country in Europe, and it only like within the last year Ukraine has claimed first spot. And I mean it's hard to say because Moldova had an excuse, partly because what's going on in Ukraine now was first like test piloted in Moldova, and right after the breakup of the USSR, Russian troops occupied this Russian-speaking area of Moldova, and it's now called Transnistria, and it's been this de facto independent frozen conflict for 30 years now. But in terms of why Ukraine stayed so poor, Adam Tooze has the better economic analysis than that. I don't really know. It's a lot of people attribute it to corruption because it has basically been politics has basically been split between oligarch clans, and that's pretty well known. Unlike Russia, the oligarch clans haven't consolidated into like a single clique, which is really that was Putin's accomplishment, like consolidating all the various oligarch factions from the 90s into under this like one centralized rule. So yeah, I mean, and you know the political factions that have kind of arisen, especially like since the Orange Revolution, it sort of channeled people's frustration into these like symbolic national politics. So either all these games with like the co-official status of Russian or delisting it, rehabilitating the like controversial World War II symbols and organizations that like collaborated with the Nazis. Either like supporting that stuff or opposing it has become these like symbolic politics that have distracted from the fact that the corruption and kind of mismanagement have continued. And why did this happen? It's because in the wake of the Orange Revolution, everyone had this euphoria that we're going to be pro-Western now, and it turned out that nothing really changed to the point that they actually ended up electing Yanukovych in 2010 for real this time. And is Russia to blame for some of that? Yeah, like they did after the Orange Revolution, they did like try to squeeze Ukraine on gas subsidies, so that certainly didn't help. But it's probably not plausible to like attribute it all to Russia.
That's good to know. One thing I would ask, I know that you've been concerned about this for a while, is the amount of commentary on the online left that pivots wildly. And while there's a tendency of people to say, I don't know anyone who thinks that, I have long since discovered that that's not the case. Like whenever I would say that before, I'm like, no, I'm meeting people in real life who clearly think that. Like the online propaganda has an effect. In general, I would say that Ukraine in the Western media and maybe in world media, because I mean even Ahmadinejad was coming out against Putin today, which is a little wild.
Yeah, that was interesting.
I would say in general, we could see that the Ukrainians have run rather facilely, unfortunately, the information war with most of the world. But I don't think people understood going up to this how to even begin to analyze this. And I know I kept them sitting on any information that I had because on one hand, I have learned a long time ago, you have to be careful with U.S. and British intelligence. On another hand, I mean, so much so that even like Zelensky was kind of didn't entirely trust what they were saying.
I mean, with Zelensky, it was a different thing because Zelensky had a different incentive, which was to like, not panic the population and to try to keep the economy flowing. So that was more the reason why they tried to like be like, guys, don't hype this up. Partly because like the Ukrainian economy was just like the Ukrainian economy just started like bleeding like a week before the actual invasion happened, partly because of like these fears. So it was more like the chance like that if there's a chance that this doesn't happen, can we not like be shooting ourselves in the foot in the meantime? But it turned out to be moot anyway.
So what we saw is a lot of leftists who have not taken anti-Ukrainian stances since then, but up until literally the moment of Putin's speech, were pushing, if not Sputnik, at least RT rhetoric around NATO's actions here. And in a way, that worries me for two reasons. One, as the reason what you've expressed on your interview on with the Intifada, that it makes international solidarity with anyone outside of Western Europe really hard. But two, and I think more importantly in some ways, the other effect that I think it had is discrediting fairly neutral parties are discredited by the fact that, frankly, neoconservative war hawks look to be correct on this. And
well, you know what they say about broken clocks,
right?
Yeah.
And also they have an incentive for this clock to be broken, right? Like, we have to be honest about that. You did see a portion of the left, particularly the people who throw around the word multi-polarity, and I think we're gonna go into that because I know a good bit of that history as far as what that word means, where it comes from, who I used to see it from, who I see it from now. Yeah. So we saw a lot of that. I mean, I literally saw yesterday, and this was on Instagram, and my Instagram is personal, right? There are a few weirdo commie people who followed me on Instagram, and I follow back. And I literally saw some American like talking about Russia's legitimacy, not for invading Ukraine, but for invading the United States with nuclear weapons. And I'm like, who the hell do you think you're convincing with that? Like, because they're like, well, it's just due to, what the CIA and blah, 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 NATO surrounding. And I'm like, okay, there are some legit concerns about NATO, but as Kuba Wendowski said, Dr. Kuba came on and talked about yesterday, one of the frustrating things about accession to the EU is that a lot of countries are also enticed to join NATO because it's way easier to do than it is to get everything through an EU process, and you get a political win for it in your home country usually.
Yeah.
But the whole accession process often means that those countries that are, given a chance to join NATO aren't ever going to get it. I mean, not NATO. Join the EU aren't ever going to get it. Like, we haven't really gotten anybody past Estonia. I talked about this in the context of Turkey, yesterday, but they can get NATO, and it's to the U.S. advantage, and that's part of what has struck Russian paranoia. Because someone has mentioned that if you had like a Finland, or not someone, Dr. Kuba mentioned if you had like a Finland deal, the Ukraine joining the EU would not be a big deal, except that in the prior experiences with like the Baltic states, that NATO comes first and the EU never comes.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to talk about that for a bit, or should we?
Yeah, I'd love for you to talk about that.
It's just now, so like I don't know where we want to start, but yeah, the NATO thing. I honestly I'm becoming more convinced that it was a red herring, considering like Putin's rhetoric since then, and considering that this invasion goes like far beyond what was needed to basically ensure that Ukraine doesn't go into NATO. So I mean, let's like I already mentioned this, right? 1992, Russia, there was a legitimate like kind of civil conflict because it's basically repeated. It's a Northern Ireland situation that has like repeated multiple times in the former Soviet territories, where the empire withdraws, the people that like settled there during the empire now see like the reassertion of the rest of the population, national movement, and they lose their kind of like de facto privileges that they enjoyed during the imperial times, and they see that as oppression, and they freak out, and they want to either like lop off their territory and attach it back to the empire, or like declare independence. So you saw that with Transnistria in Moldova, and I haven't like studied that as closely. I don't think Russia directly fomented that. I think Moscow had bigger problems to deal with, really. But once like the fighting started, they did firmly come in and basically occupy the area, and it's still de facto independent from Moldova now. They have some kind of like working functional arrangement. Been there actually a couple of times.
So that's very similar to what happened in Georgia in 2008. Exactly. And that's honestly what I thought was going to happen, like, which is not something that I was super happy about. But my right, because of course I thought, of course, Putin's building up military. He's going to take the two separatist republics and ensure that there is absolutely no chance for Ukraine to join NATO, because it would automatically trigger Article 5, and that was even his early rhetoric.
Yeah, but again, I just want to emphasize that Transnistria happened before any NATO expansion, right? And Georgia happened in 2008. That was right after the Bucharest summit, where they did like the stupidest thing possible, where they just announced that yes, we want Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO, but we're not going to do anything about it. We're not going to give them any security guarantees. We're just announcing this thing that is going to deeply antagonize Russia that they've warned us about, and then we're leaving it. Georgia happened in 2008, but like the sort of like willingness to, this is like the Western centric like leftism, where like NATO and the West are the only entities that have agency, and everyone else is only reacting to them. And that's the kind of thing. And for all the talk of that people like make, allusions to realpolitik, like Russia is a large state, a large power, even at its weakest point in like 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was able to exert its influence. And yes, it sees its as like a huge land power. It sees its strategic interest in terms of its sphere of influence and the near abroad. And this doesn't make it better or worse than the United States, but there's a weird like tendency to like dismiss any kind of agency in that regard for Russia, and then only attribute that agency to NATO and the West, and Russia is just reacting to that. So no, like Russia would have tried to exert political control over its like neighboring states regardless, is kind of the whole point.
So in some ways this becomes a game where Russia may have legitimate security concerns to NATO, but what people don't seem to be paying attention to is that why are all these countries flocking to NATO in the first place?
Because they're all Nazis, right? That's the left answer. That's basically people don't say that outright, but in there you can see that in a lot of like left rhetoric about Eastern Europe. The basic assumption is that all these countries, for anyone in these countries who doesn't want to just like basically submit to Russian dominion, is probably some kind of NATO Nazi, right? And like, yeah, it's a complete disregard for just like the entire populations of these the actual people living there.
I also found it interesting. I saw this yesterday, and I guess this will bring us back to the first part of that question that I compounded by talking too much. I saw this yesterday where people were talking about the EU and NATO will only bring neoliberalism, and I'm like, what the fuck is Russia going to bring? Because it's not like Russia has encouraged these places to build lavish Nordic style social democracies with authoritarian oligarch countries. Like it's not like Russia has not had severe austerity even after the Chicago Boys period, which yes, I mean the United States takes some severe blame for that and guiding Yeltsin, although so does corruption within Russia itself. But it's not like you've seen. I was asking someone to explain to me, okay, if the option was just like some kind of return to, I don't know, Soviet style industrial planning with some kind of like really quasi-authoritarian social democracy or whatever.
Yeah, apart from the fact that that's impossible. But
yes, that's not going to happen. Like,
Right.
explain to me why. I mean, why a country as powerful as Russia has a military capacity as Russia has a scientific capacity as Russia still has not been able to produce a manufacturing economy above that of a small Western European nation by itself. Like, it's not like Russia. Like, even now with China backing up, and everyone's like, well, China's going to de-dollarize, and I'm like, it'll de-dollarize over time, but it was going to do that anyway. Like, but even the yuan is a tiny portion of world reserve currencies. Even if like 33% of world trade is traded in yuan, reserve currency in yuan is only like 5% or something. I think I might even be high, which tells you a lot of things. That that China hasn't even been trying to set itself up as an alternative economic order like you would hear in the early BRICS days.
Yeah.
So we're left with the question, like, well, what does Russia have on offer for Ukraine that's better that they're turning down due to these Nazis? And the answer that I can see is not a lot. I mean, the economy is slightly better in Russia, and there's a lot of cultural intermixture. There's a history there, but there's also a history of hostility, frankly, particularly when you start bringing up pre-Soviet states whose relationship to modern nationhood is questionable. And that's not just true on the Ukrainian side. It is also true on the Russian side.
No, I mean, yeah, economically, Russia is not offering Ukraine anything different, except, I mean, when in the choice in 2014 with like the EU agreement, when the EU and the IMF offered like a pitifully small amount, right? But then with a couple of this, like, there's a cultural to this too. And, it's not just a nationalist thing. It was, the offer was, you're going to be part of the EU, you're going to be part of Western democracy, which was legitimately, we on the left tend to like scoff at the idea of democracy, liberalism, like, but for people who have only lived under like, either sort of like authoritarian, like actually existing socialism, or sort of corrupt oligarchy, that is still like a powerful idea, especially for the kind of like aspirational middle classes, students, professionals. So the idea of like joining the EU, like being able to study at European universities, that was really appealing to like a large. I mean, not again, these people don't represent the masses. Of course, it is a specific class that really is interested in that kind of promise. But like the appeal is legitimate, and it had very little to do with Ukrainian nationalism, and more with just this kind of like cosmopolitan European promise, which Russia countered. What Russia was offering economically, was like, they offered more money, but the sort of like strings that came with that, and the cultural campaign that Russia itself ran long before they started talking about NATO or anything. It was like it's a reactionary, like conservative, orthodox, imperialist worldview that they have like more and more openly embraced. And these, there were all these posters that like, oh, if Ukraine joins the EU, like gays and like Euro pederasts teaching your children about sex and all this stuff, versus like strong, and they would put like Soviet symbols next to Orthodox churches, and like the Aryan women in wheat fields meme, that kind of thing, like based trad Russia, as the extremely online people say. So that that is like that was how like the rhetorical lines were defined, long before any kind of talk of NATO really came up.
So we can go into that more. One thing that I have seen, though, I saw it in 2014, I saw it now, is that there have been certain groups that are even marginalized within Russia, like Alexander Dugin. When the liberals discovered him in 2015, 2016, he'd already lost his seat at Moscow University. He had written a kind of infamous book in Russia called Putin versus Putin, etc. But a bunch of basically Democratic operatives and actually some neoconservatives who wanted to increase tensions with Russia found him because he said inflammatory things about states. He'd also, going back to the 90s, been instrumental in like trying to increase national Bolshevism. He'd made reach outs to stuff like Greka, that is the French New Right. Though they are Nazis. He made well, some of them are Nazis anyway. For those of you who don't know, that's GRECE, and it has people like Alain de Boniste and Guillaume Fay in it, and a lot of people that are associated with Identity Europa and stuff like that. And he made forays to things like Golden Dawn and Casa Pound in Italy. So like the people who are talking about anti-fascist stuff using information that is from this man have been throwing me for a loop. And I have been quiet about it in the past, although one thing I will say, I have a lot of Russian connections because I worked abroad. I've talked about this a lot. I have a lot of Ukrainian connections because I worked abroad. In 2013, a man that I knew from right-wing circles, actually, we'll say his name is Mark S. He was an associate, an American associate, expatriate living in Moscow, who was an outreach coordinator for one of the Dugin, I think it's International Fourth Positionism, reached out to me to promote, because I was a blogger, to promote articles they were writing on anti-imperialism. And I turned it down. I saw some other people who were associated with the Workers' World Party in America who would often get on RT back when leftists used RT for news, which people who are younger forget this. Before the Russiagate stuff, RT was like one of the American left's favorite news sources. And I would tell people, be careful with that. It reports a lot of honest stuff on the United States because it has geopolitical reasons to do so. But you can't trust it on Russia. It's, one step removed from being owned by the Russian government. And they're like, well, you can trust NPR. And I'm like, can you really? But anyway, and I saw that happen then in the 2014 crisis, but it didn't go very far. In the Syria crisis, which was also happening simultaneously, I saw more and more people get involved in this. And in fact, a story that I don't think I've talked about publicly, when I took over the North Star, I literally realized that there were different people who were who were associated with different lines abroad. One of whom was following like jihadist accounts in the Free Syrian Army on Twitter before they were all banned, and the other of whom was pushing this Duginist stuff into our publication, and they were writing under names like Red de Mestre and stuff like that. So people who were not even hiding that it was real red brown stuff. Cut to 2017, 2018. You see all these people who are actually really are. They seem like they are like borderline U.S. State Department assets, pushing red brown back. So you see all these people who deny that the red brown problem is a thing. Right. And then
again, just because the State Department is talking about something doesn't mean the opposite is true.
Right. And so then you start seeing people like pick up stuff like multipolar media, dividing this, that, and the other. Now, the multipolarity thing is interesting because it's a thesis that was pretty common in the Bush years amongst just normal political wonks, like Fareed Zakaria, if you remember, like the Kind of America, the Multipolar War. But very quickly in the early teens, it became associated with fourth political theory explicitly. So it's when Arcos Press, which is a fascist publishing house, which publishes stuff in English but out of India, published that book in English. That word became a tell is multipolarity because it was a way to rebrand Eurasianism from its czarist sort of theories in the late 19th, pre-Bolshevik, early 20th century.
Yeah.
And I've seen that word explode amongst people who have no idea of its history and origins.
Yeah, it just becomes like all. I mean, this isn't even anti-imperialism, right? This is just alt-imperialism. This is saying instead of one imperialism, we should have several. And for some reason, people kind of don't like their cognitive dissonance doesn't click with that.
Yeah, I mean, although if let's be fair, this has happened with leftists in the past with a more serious sense. A man that I deeply respect, W.E.B. Du Bois, wrote a whole book defending had a whole position defending a Japanese empire, which Gerald Horne has written a book defending that position in the last 20 years.
Right. Yeah. The idea of like applying the sort of like oppressor framework to competing, to not even like this isn't even anti-colonialism, right? This is competing nations. Say the idea that Japan put forward, right? What was that quote that the diplomat said? Like the Western powers, having taught Japan the game of cards, now want to take away the table, right? It's like, oh, you guys all got to do imperialism, but you're not letting us do it, and that somehow constitutes like that's like a underdog. It's just like this underdog mentality that's for some reason.
Right, and but ignores underdogs like Korea and Manchuria. However, because of the results of World War II, that position has been flushed down the memory hole.
Well, even Germany was putting forward that,
right?
And during Molotov-Ribbentrop, which a lot of certain sorts of leftists don't like to talk about.
They don't like to talk about it because they like to talk about how the Great Periodic War got rid of the Nazis, and I will say it outright, but not how Molotov-Ribbentrop actually enabled the Nazis to do a lot of what they did.
Yeah, right. And I mean, the Soviet Union itself was kind of supporting that for a bit during Molotov-Ribbentrop, was supporting that line of like Germany is a proletarian nation against these like hegemonic empires of UK and France, right? So, and Germany had its own like anti-imperialist appeal to India. Even they tried to make contacts with the IRA.
It even gets left communists like Karl Radek in trouble when he's encouraged to do. Left Bolsheviks in trouble when he's encouraged to do outreach, because at one point, like, he accidentally praises a communist killer in Germany,
right?
And stuff like that. There's a ton of history about the left making this mistake because it's looking at things from purely geopolitical calculuses. The other thing I will say is, everyone assumes that because Russiagate was bullshit, that there's no such thing as misinformation bots. I know for a fact, and again, part of it's because I've been approached by it myself, but I know for a fact that a lot of nations that are larger nations will go out to media people, and the West does this too, and dangle grants, sponsorship money, etc., to get them to push certain lines. They do it. It's known.
I mean, right? Israel is great at it.
Israel's like probably the best at it, actually. I mean, so, the United States does it. I mean, it does it internally too, which is why, for example, when you hear some of these reports of like what we talked about, these red brown hunters who are also, working with the FBI or whatever, that's not unreal. But the assumption that only the U.S. is doing it because, I don't know, Russiagate was hysteria played up by a bunch of liberals, which is what I get thrown at, is not just naive. It kind of bewilders my mind that they think that, like, why do you think the United States and the West are the only nations that would have access to something as cheap as you?
Well, a big part of this is like most of these people don't speak Russian, don't read Russian. They don't. So the Russian media is just a totally black box to them, right? They just assume that it's like, like our media, but with the opposite geopolitical line or something.
Right. That's true for a lot of stuff. Like, I used to talk about how Al Jazeera is one thing in English and something completely different in Arabic.
Yep. Right. So yeah, the classic thing was, during the Maidan, the demonstrations in Ukraine that eventually led to toppling Yanukovych, the English language Russian media was like saying, "Oh, these are Nazis." The Russian language stuff that was directed to the domestic audience was like saying they're Jews. So, but like people that don't have access to Russian media, don't really understand like Russian, like Russophone society, I would say, even apart from the people who understand it better are like the just like extremely online like people who like play Counter-Strike and with like Suka Byat. But like those people at least understand Russia a little bit better than just like leftists commenting on it through like whatever they read on Gray Zone or something.
Well, yeah, this does lead me to an interesting development that we've seen because, for example, we have seen a lot of leftists take positions at RT. Some of them left. I think like Abby Martin, for example, left RT and has kind of tread some interesting lines during this conflict, but has not been pro Putin. But you've had this whole phenomenon where you have former people who were leftists in the United States who've now been brought into Russian media, and the most famous one is Caleb Maupin. He was the head of the Workers' World Party, got booted out after appearing at a conference with Alexander Dugin, and then kind of disappeared for a while, and then came back up as a Twitter, YouTube celebrity around people like Infrahaz and Peter Coffin. Peter Coffin, a man who I've sat and had dinner with, and he was chastising Doug Lane for not being intersectional enough only 3 years ago. All right. Like for real, like that's not made up. That there was a whole like debate at University of Idaho that was initiated by Peter Coffin, he didn't even really participate in it, about intersectionality, because of a fight he had with Doug Lane online, and I say this because so you have a Russian media, a guy who works for Russian media explicitly, Maupin, who comes out of the American left, but has been making forays on RT since like 2012. You have a bunch of streamers, and they have been talking about integrating not just, first it was reviving Duginism, then it was, kind of parlor Stalinism based off of Stalin's writings in the late 40s and 50s. So it actually ignores a lot of what Stalinists historically believed, but goes into that. And then you started hearing multi-polarity talk, like in that order. And I can tell you now, because I follow some of these people on Twitter, and I'm not going to out who they are, but some of them are like literally following Christian nationalist on European Christian nationalist on Twitter, like to own the libs. And this is a real problem because it's based off of foreign policy naivete and this idea that anti-imperialism is against whatever the West wants. There's that famous Swiss fascist poster with the Klan bot and all that walking and representing America that represents anti-imperialism, and people don't know it's a fascist poster.
Right. I haven't seen that one, but show me.
And stuff like that. So it's been wild for me watching people deny Red Brown stuff as like I increasingly see it. I increasingly see the verbiage improve in the pudding.
Let me talk about it a little bit, because this is so. Yeah, the fact that people can't read Russian media, so they're getting all this stuff filtered third hand through like whatever English language stuff comes out. So everyone wants to talk about Azov Battalion, and let me be clear, like Ukrainian nationalism fucking sucks. The Euro army axe murdered my like great grandfather, and his great uncle, and yeah, like rehabilitating these like Stepan Bandera and these like symbols is not only disgusting, it's like stupid, because Poland is like a huge ally that they're relying on.
And the other people that Bandera purged were the Poles,
right?
Because
so both Poland and Israel, who's also like giving a lot of aid to, also has a relationship with Ukraine. they've both like made noises about it occasionally, but apparently, not enough. But yeah, it is this play to like, and people misread that as like, oh, the Ukrainian government is run by the Nazis, it's ruled by the Nazis. Like, no, it's the Ukrainian fascists, like the Azov battalion and right sector. They represent a very small but well-organized minority within Ukrainian society. And I mean, right sector straight up attacked the Kyiv parliament in like 2015, like after the post-Maidan government. So what this kind of stuff is usually, and the far right parties barely have any representation in parliament. What this kind of stuff is like this uneasy coexistence where Ukrainian politicians try to pass these like symbolic nationalist stuff, like rehabilitating the symbols of Stepan Bandera, to try to like pacify these like guys with a huge street presence that can like cause trouble for them.
Someone asked me like why they don't because the Azov battalion is the one that's focused on the West. It's actually not even the one that like, what's the one that killed that attacked the Union shop that is being used as the pretext for genocide, which is kind of like you're using like a.
Oh, that was the Odessa thing. That was like a battle between like pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian football ultras.
Right.
I forget what the specific names were. But people repeat this third hand. They're like, oh, didn't they just like burn a bunch of communists in a building? Like, I mean, no, I'm not justifying this was like horrible, and human rights orders have investigated it and kind of been inconclusive on. But this was a fight that between two groups of football ultras that by some reports the pro-Russian one started when they attacked like a pro-Ukrainian parade. But again, regardless if we started it, the fight got out of control. They were both throwing Molotov cocktails at each other, and then some people say they barricaded them in the building, some people say they just got chased into the building, and the building caught on fire because of the Molotov cocktails. But the idea that this was like a planned genocide extermination and that's literally the way people repeat it, because again they didn't
because it was repeated that way as a Russian pretext, like the only example actually they had,
right, as opposed to genocide. Like the multiple like thousands of people who have been like either like beaten, tortured, disappeared, or just like forced out of their homes in these like independent people's republics. Anyone who was seen as having pro-Ukrainian sympathies. Nothing like that, as far as I know, has happened like in the actual Ukrainian held territory. Like, people aren't getting genocided for having pro-Russian views, even though obviously you're probably not welcome in like polite society at this point for if you have that. But no, what I want to talk about is so everyone wants to talk about like Azov battalion, right? And every time leftists think they're very smart for like replying to some like media story about Ukraine, it's like, oh, what about this? And it literally has the same like tone as like when Zionists reply to like pro-Palestinian stuff, like, what about Hamas? Are you a supporter of Hamas? Are you an Islamic fundamentalist? And it's like equally stupid. Okay, but so they know about that. They know zero about what the actual character of like these these like Russian militias in Eastern Ukraine is. And if you just like were curious at all, if you like wanted to look it up at all, you would see a whole sea of Nazi symbols. Let's see, who's the Varyag battalion, the Rusich battalion with a sun wheel as their thing. I mean, the famous Wagner group, which is also seen like posing with Nazi flags.
You would occasionally see some of these people brought up actually in there and what they did in Syria, but they're never brought up in the Ukrainian context. Actually, some of them were brought into Syria to do stuff.
And my point is like, if this isn't like a whataboutism, it's not like, oh, see, Russia has fascist groups too. It's like, not only does Russia have fascist groups, in Ukraine you have like this uneasy like cooperation between like a fascist battalion and a government whose orientation is largely like liberal Western. In Russia, most of these groups, and again, this is also like kind of a inability of leftists to understand what Russia means when they talk about fascism. most of these groups, yeah, they might not have the specific like German symbols we're looking for, but their stated ideology is just like a more extreme version of the official Russian state ideology, which is this like imperial Orthodox nostalgia. So a lot of these like battalions in Novorossiya are their ideology is that of the White Army and the Black Hundreds, which again, if you're people who don't know much about Eastern Europe, I mean, maybe if you've studied the Russian Revolution, you would know that, but people don't understand how fucking scary that is, especially like, I mean, as an Eastern European Jew, like I have no problem saying that like people LARPing the White Guards and the Black Hundreds are every bit as scary as German Sieg Heil Nazis.
Yeah, or even like the Order of the
about the
Occasion.
history of pogroms and who committed those pogroms, like.
Or even honestly, I mean, like to be completely, I'm going to say something really that I think people who know the intellectual history of Eastern Europe and of Germany can say, like, a lot of the infrastructure and accusations made against the Bolsheviks and the Jews by the Nazis was literally picked up by right Russian immigrants to Central Europe. Like that's what.
And I mean, who wrote the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? Right, it was right. Secret police. So, and again, all these people who talk about Ukrainian Nazis don't seem very curious to ask what the reaction of like actual Jewish communities in Ukraine and why
do they have a Jewish Russian speaking president?
Yeah, and I mean, people dismiss that as tokenism, but regardless of that, all of the official statements from like actual organized Jewish communities. None of them have supported this, like, Ukraine is a Nazi country, we need to be liberated by Russia. Russia, the famous historical defender of Jews and minorities. And it's just so absurd. But people actually take this seriously because Western leftists are just like have this like Pavlovian thing, like they hear Nazi and they're like, yes, that's what we, obviously whoever's using that is using it in good faith.
And that leads to funny things like this anti-fascist conference that is just BRICS, which is just BRICS countries, one of which is Bolsonaro's Brazil and the other
Saudi Arabia. That's
and Modi's India. And if people know anything about the Hindu-Vadist movement, and they explicitly take stuff from fascist German ideology, like they don't even hide it. So it becomes like a joke.
So people who haven't bothered to ask, like, why is it that Ukrainian Jewish communities, by and large, prefer to fight, prefer to side with Ukraine and even fight a lot, like, why Jewish Ukrainian soldiers are fighting alongside, not in it, but alongside the Azov battalion rather than welcoming these anti-fascist liberators from Russia? It's because Ukrainian Jews they know exactly what Russia and Putin claiming, that the Russian Orthodox world, they know exactly what those people, like whose ideological descendants those people are and what they represent. And they represent the fucking pogromists. And this is like the other thing with the way that Putin has seized on the use of like applied the like Nazism and fascism to basically everything. It's completely consistent with the fact that starting with Stalin and the USSR, and then especially like after the fall of the USSR, when Russia had, was casting about for like what's our national identity, they made the victory in the Great Patriotic War, right? So there's already this like glorification of like what in most of the rest of the world is called World War II and is just considered like a horrible thing. I mean, the US has its own like sort of mythology about being the heroes there, but not to the extent that Russia does. Like Russia really, literally, its entire identity is built on we defeated fascism in the Great Patriotic War. And but the interesting thing there is that they don't have, there isn't really like, that doesn't really involve like an understanding. It's not like, oh, we defended Jews from genocide and we killed like a genocidal madman. We stopped, we stopped like autocratic tyranny. Like that's not part of the mythology, right? Because on their own, Russian ideology doesn't have a problem with these things. They don't have a problem with authoritarianism or anti-Semitism, or persecution of LGBT people or any of the other stuff Hitler did. The main thing that made fascism bad for this like Russian ideology was that it invaded Russia. So when Putin says fascism and Nazism, the way he's using it and the way most Russians have come to understand it through this ideology is fascism equals anything that threatens Russia, which is why modern Germany and liberal gender ideology, that's all fascism too.
Yeah, it's very similar. Actually, what's remarkably, it's very similar to how Nazi comparisons are used on the right for everything.
Yeah.
Even sometimes to defend Nazis.
Right.
And we see that in the American right, but we have, you and I, are not purely products of the US. And so this marvelized view of the world does not come out in our worldview as much. But I see that a lot where, for example, the situation with China, where I'm like, look, I think most of the reports from the U.S. about the genocide of the Uyghurs are highly exaggerated to the point of to the point of it discrediting any concern. But that does not mean that I think that there's nothing going on with the Chinese nation building project. And that does not mean that I think that all the people in the region are super happy about it. For example, can you explain to me ideologically why Vietnam and China have such tense relations? I bet you can't, because they're both liberalized communists. And by liberalized, I mean they have markets, communist states whose even religious and ethnic backgrounds are very similar. And yet what would actually explain it is, the Chinese Vietnamese War, the Chinese support of Pol Pot, the the Khmer Rouge's war with the Vietnamese, actually even the Chinese détente with the Americans opening up in the 70s, which Vietnam took as a personal offense. I mean, there is all this history that explains what's going on there that Americans don't know. And to be fair, it's even kind of more egregious that they don't know in China and Vietnam because their government's more involved. But the NATO context is interesting to me because it's similar, where I'm like, did anyone actually think that the Ukraine was going to join NATO right now? Because the Donbass and Luhansk reasons meant that it would automatically trigger Article 5, and that's a world war. Nobody in NATO is that stupid.
Yeah.
They might be, I mean, they are imperialists. Don't get me wrong, but they're not that dumb. So I figured this had to be for domestic reasons, but even I thought I stupidly trusted Putin's actions in the past, where I thought, okay, they're going to go in and occupy Donbass and Luhansk as the two separatist republics, and they're going to really hunker down there like they did in Crimea. It'll be a lot more hot because the internal populations of the areas are more it's not as clear cut in Crimea, where it's like Crimea was the crown jewel of the USSR, a big part of Imperial Russia, but it for reasons of internal territorial stability, Khrushchev puts it over Ukrainian oversight. Okay, that whether you like it or not, that's a different thing than even Luhansk and Donbass, but that's where I thought they'd end it, because that's also what had happened in Moldova. That's also what had happened in Georgia. And I saw immediate beeline to Kiev.
Right. But I mean, I thought that too, but in retrospect, it was stupid to think that, it's Hume's paradox, right? Like, why do you assume that the future will resemble the past? And there's one way in which the future doesn't resemble the past, which is that Putin is getting older. He's 70 now. And, and there's an election in 2 years. I mean, the stuff that Russia has been doing, it's not conclusive, right? It requires this continuous, balancing act where you aid the separatist republics, but Russia never absorbed Transnistria. And the annexation of Crimea was actually interesting because that was the only time that Russia has actually annexed one of these separatist regions, and that's because it had been part of Russia before. Everyone knows, Russia transferred it to Khrushchev transferred it to Ukraine in the 50s. So there's a different sort of story there, because it was a lot easier to claim that Crimea is Russian, which is not to justify the annexation, but yeah. So keeping all this stuff in perpetual kind of limbo, is like increasingly a tough balancing act, especially Putin's. This is like personal. I don't like psychological speculation about leaders, but yeah, he's getting older. He's thinking about his legacy. He wanted something more conclusive. He wanted a more conclusive resolution to this, which you could kind of tell in like what he was pushing, the demands that they were pushing for from NATO. Because like we've said, no one there was not even the remotest possibility that Ukraine was going to join NATO in the near future, and NATO and Biden said as much directly to Putin. Like they were willing to do all but like give a formal guarantee. They were saying, look, like it's just leave it alone. It's not happening. It's fine. But Putin insisted on Russia insisted on getting it in writing, getting a formal commitment to that NATO would never admit Ukraine. And this is interesting to me because like this seems like the kinds of demands that Austria-Hungary made to Serbia, like the demands that are designed to be rejected. Because, and for a lot of like Westerners and leftists and people opposed to NATO, it seems like a perfectly reasonable demand. Like, yeah, no, like stop NATO expansion. But the way that it was framed, the way that this demand was presented to NATO would have been impossible for NATO to accept without like undermining its own kind of like fundamental constitutional basis. This is like my theory, at least, because look at how does NATO define itself? NATO defines itself as a voluntary defensive alliance of democracies that is in theory open to any country that wants to join. Now, when Russia had asked to join NATO in the 90s, and I think under late Yeltsin, early Putin, whether that actually would have been like feasible or possible, that's like an interesting alt history to speculate.
My Dr. Kuba says that the moment you accept Poland, and that's impossible.
Yeah. But right. So, but like this narrative that NATO has itself, that's its whole like legitimate. NATO's claim to legitimacy rests on this, right? That it is not, and what Russia was asking from NATO was to discard that and to sit down with it at the table as like a fellow great power and to carve up spheres of influence. So what Russia was basically asking NATO is to discard its like claim to legitimacy on being like representing like the global democratic order, and just like admit that it's an extension of Western and American specifically interests, right? Which as good leftists we all think it is, right? But,
right, which while true, it cannot do.
Yeah, right. It's effective to asking NATO to disband itself. So yeah, this demand, like, well, why can't NATO just? It would have had to come from Ukraine itself, saying that it will not join NATO, which was increasingly hard to do when it's literally being invaded by Russia. And I don't mean the current invasion. I mean since 2014. So like, yeah, no Ukrainian government could have survived, announcing without some like careful diplomatic route that made it seem believable. No Ukrainian government could have survived just announcing, "Oh, we're pledging to stay neutral and not join NATO," because it would have been obvious that it was, stopping to Russian demand that was being imposed by force. And so, yeah, that's where we are now.
See, what I worry about here is, I knew some, I've known Ukrainians who are a little bit more pro-Russian than yourself, but they probably aren't anymore. I haven't talked to them, but
any Ukrainians that are pro-Russian by now have probably fled to Russia.
Right, they've either gone to Russia or they become Ukrainian nationalists. Because the one thing that everyone seems to be surprised by, I know that Dr. Kuba was surprised by, was how fast this consolidated a Ukrainian identity, which, if people don't know, is not. While nationalism is a problem in Eastern Europe for reasons that I think have to do with how recently nationalism has been allowed there.
Right.
It still seems somewhat like people still have living memory of multi-ethnic empires in which they were totally subordinated, and they even view like the Soviet Union and whatnot, for all its early what might be called affirmative action policies in the American parlance, by the Great Patriotic War, were sort of pushed to the wayside, thus increasing tensions in places like Latvia and Ukraine, and and you also had this, something I think was slightly a mistake on the Bolsheviks' part, which was the marrying it up to romantic nationalism from the 19th century to some degree to consolidate national identities and create, not totally illegitimate, but not totally coherent, national mythologies of the past, going back in Ukraine to the Kievan-Rus and this and the other. I mean, the irony though now is it leads to the Eurasianists and the Kievan and the Western Ukrainians who buy, like, they're the true descendants of the Kievan-Rus and they're the unpolluted Russians. They actually kind of arguing the same thing.
Yeah. Right. That's the funny thing, right? Because both of them are like claiming legitimacy in the Kievan-Rus.
Right, and also like the Eurasianist argument is that Eurasia is special because of we're a massive land power where Europe and Asia met, and this goes back all the way to the Mongol running of the parts of the Rus that were run by the Mongols, and thus. And then that's also that's the Ukrainian ultra right pollution story, as like the Mongols polluted our pure
we're the true Europeans, we're the true Western Europeans, and the Russians are just like Mongol hordes,
right. And I mean, the irony is that they're both actually claiming both the same similar creation, national creation myth, and they're both actually kind of accepting each other's characterization of what they are, and all this does have to totally ignore, for example, how much of modern identity in either area is a result of the late 19th century being consolidated by the Bolsheviks into their 20th century nation policy.
Right. I mean, there's a kernel truth in that, like the origin of like why is there even a difference between like Russian and Ukrainian culture, or why did this difference arise? It does lie in the Mongol invasion, and like that it happened to more or less stop at Kiev. And so, the parts that ended up under Poland and Lithuania, the parts of Kievan-Rus that ended up under Poland and Lithuania would eventually become, proto-Ukrainian identity, whereas Moscow sort of, was a vassal of the Mongol state for, 200 something years. But this is, so yeah, if you want to talk about like historical origins, but this is like, we're talking 13th century here, right?
Right.
And a lot of things have happened since then.
I mean, my point is that, like, these are like there's some truth to these national myths, because all national myths have some truth, but they're national myths. Like,
right. And I mean, there's also like the third thing that kind of also agrees with that narrative is like, this like neocon kind of, you'll periodically get these like things like, Russia as the orientalizing, like, Russia as the Asian invader, Russia embraces its Oriental despotism, that kind of thing. So it's like all of these people are saying the same thing. They just have a difference on whether like it's good or bad. Right.
Yeah, and which side is good or bad in it.
Right.
But like it's still kind of similar mythologies. I wanted to ask you, how much purchase, like, I want to talk to some Russian expatriates in America about this too, who can read and do read Russian media and can tell me, but how much purchase does this national narrative actually have in Russia? Because, for example, I know that, like, say, and this is on the American right, actually more than the American left, but in the American, like, ultra religious right who's not Protestant, so you look at someone like Ron Dreyer, there's this narrative of like restored orthodoxy coming out of Russia, and that somehow, because of the oppression of the Soviet Union, the corruptive influence of liberal culture has not affected the Russian church, which I actually kind of used to believe until I started meeting Russians, like, to be honest. And Russians from Russia, when I was working, particularly when I was in Egypt and in Korea, and then I was like, oh, you guys don't go to church that much, huh? Like, I mean, like, like, yeah, you're more religious than, say, Czechia, where, you know, like the secular patterns of the late Soviet period have actually maintained. But
Well, that was, I mean, yeah, that the Czechia is weird because it's the most atheist country in Europe, and it's weird even within Eastern Europe, which largely turned more religious after, and that there's a weird history there to do with the Hussite wars in like the 15th century, but no, let's not go there.
Yeah, that's a whole different ball game. And I guess the other point that I have to say is, like, I've studied, you know, you may not know this about me, but my ethnic heritage is about half Scotch Irish Welsh and about half I like to call it Ottoman Jew, but it's like Bulgarian and North African Jews.
Right, Sephardi.
Yeah, Sephardi, and particularly from Bulgaria. So I've been studying, you know, Central and Eastern Europe for a long time because it's, you know, related to my history, and I came away with, like, man, that place has never been ethnically sorted ever until the Bolsheviks kind of did it to end the various. But it kind of didn't happen until both the Bolsheviks and the Ataturk finally sorted everybody. Even the Nazis couldn't do it. And but I say that to say the national histories of any of these countries is wild and hard to figure out how it relates. I mean, my main concern is Bulgaria, but, like, what relationship does modern Bulgaria have to, like, the Bulgar Khanate, to, you know, Orthodox Slavs, to what, like, no one really knows. Like, you know, there's a national myth, but the more historians dig into it, it's like, this is a mess. And the more I looked at Eastern Europe as a whole, that's true for everybody. Like, borders have been moving around. I mean, even in the sense of, like, the Muscovy claim to the Second Rome based off of Novgorod. I mean, that has to be, like, the Novgorod system had to be suppressed by Ivan Terrible in English, Ivan Dostoevsky, and all this. Like, it's not, there's not a clear national story in the way there is in England and France. But Americans tend to read everything like it's England and France. And I was literally talking to someone, like, this is not a leftist, this is just a liberal. It was like, America's a super young country and all these other countries are ancient. And I'm like, even German identity is a modern production, my friend.
Yeah.
Like,
Italy. Yeah.
Like, in Eastern Europe, this is an even more recent phenomenon. This is a phenomenon of the 20th century. So, and it's one that, in some ways, the kind of struggles that you saw in Europe in the early part of the 20th century in Eastern Europe happened in the 90s, because the Soviet Union kind of kept all that from, while it developed these national identities and even accelerated the nationalization process, it also kind of let internationalist competition and consolidation to a minimum, because, you know, it was a big old country with a lot of bombs. So, to be very simple, and that's now all accelerated, right? So, and the American left seems, and the American right, frankly, American marginal political, like, extremely political people, don't seem to be able to deal with this, and they're talking about these areas.
Right. You had a question at the beginning, which was like, to what extent does this, like, Russian?
Yeah, how much does this affect Russia now? Like, how much do they believe that? I don't know.
So, you know, it's very hard to say, because basically there's a selection bias at play here, in that anyone you would talk to who knows Russian and
speaks English, right?
Yeah, right. Including me, the kinds of people that I'm likely to talk to back in Russia are, you know, not the people that would believe this, like, Putinist imperial, great Orthodox Russia. Like, those people don't want to talk to me for various reasons. So it's hard for me to, like, or anyone really, this should be a lesson, like, this doesn't just apply to Russia, this really applies to anywhere. Like, how much can anyone really, like, accurately say, like, oh, what the public mood is, what the zeitgeist is?
I don't think we even say it in the United States a lot of the time, frankly.
Right. The sort of, like, hillbilly whispering, right? Like, the true, like, what really motivates Trump's America, right? Like,
that, as a person from Trump's America, I don't know. Like, So,
well, but you're someone who climbed out, so that already, right? You're already detached from it.
right, exactly. So but even then, as you hear my ethnicity and all this, like, yes, I'm from dirt farmers in Georgia, but only the half of that, the Scotch Irish half,
Right.
with the standard ethnicity for the region. So it's like my experience can't be taken as the average, like, working class poor Southerner experience, even though I do know that world.
Right.
But I can't speak for it. Like, the moment you leave it, you can't really speak for it.
Exactly.
And the people who can speak for it probably don't want to, frankly. So
right. So, and this is like, and I think this question is why I came back to this question, is because I think this is actually key to what happens now, because what we've seen in the last day or so is, Russia for the first time released casualty statistics publicly, for the domestic audience, which, are disputed, but that's aside from the point. The point is they acknowledge that they're in a war in Ukraine and that there have been casualties. So Russians at home now, while before this it was like only like the politically active people, the liberals, the people who like had friends and relatives abroad. And a lot of the population was like, oh, it's not happening. It's propaganda. There's just some, there's some limited operation there.
Right. Yeah.
Now it's starting to hit home that Russia is at war in Ukraine, a country where many Russians, like not just, the liberal cosmopolitan class, but many Russians literally have family there. And so what is this doing to how are people at home responding to this? Is there going to be an intensification of this, imperial mission, or are people going to be like, what the fuck, enough? And it's kind of hard to tell from like watching here. And again, the people that you're likely to make contact with in Russia are overwhelmingly going to be, sort of give you a one-sided.
They're going to be well educated, and they're going to have picked one side or the other.
Yeah.
Like you might meet people who are super pro Putin from that elite class as well.
Right.
I mean, I ran into this when people talk about China, and I've spent a lot of time in China, but I don't speak Mandarin. But I know, because, having spent time in China, that like when I teach, like even when I teach Chinese students here, I'm like, I'm teaching the children of elite people, these commentators that you hear who speak English and were educated in the States and like are even pro China stands who, they a lot of them don't even live in China anymore. Like it's the both sides story, whether you're getting the liberal story or the other story, is messed up. Another example of that, so people can kind of get it, maybe, because I'm just trying to teach people why they probably can't interpret the world very well. I used to tell people like, hey, Trump is popular in Egypt, and everyone's like, what? I'm like, Trump's popular in Egypt because the common people in Egypt see Obama as betraying them, right? Because he didn't pick a side in the Arab Spring for geopolitical reasons. Now, Trump is no longer popular in Egypt because he recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and that dropped his popularity there immensely. But if you talk to the Egyptians that could easily talk to us, they were all Hillary people, right? Because they spoke English and were liberally educated at elite schools and were like the children of diplomats. Those are the people who could easily speak to us. Now, you could meet, like, the average Egyptian actually does have English skills, because in some ways it's easier to learn to read English than non-standardized Arabic. And so you can communicate with everyday people in Egypt if you're there. And if you're willing to do stuff in writing, and if you have some Arabic skills, right? But they're also not going to express everything to you either, because like you're not an insider.
Yeah.
Like you don't understand the complicatedness of the politics.
Yeah.
And same with Russia, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't been to Russia proper since since I was 5, because even in my travels, like I went back to basically all the former Soviet states in the West, on the western part. But to get into Russia, you need a pretty involved visa process. But so the only other source you have is like reading Russian media and looking at like forums and comments, which as we know from like YouTube and Twitter comments, also
Yep.
might not be the most representative portions of society, but do kind of give you a more like unfiltered stuff. And yeah, I mean, really like the level of like everyday support for this kind of like really like embittered anti-Western it's like weird. It was sort of, I mean, it was Trumpism before it was Trump, because it combines, it's social conservative, not like, it's social conservatism not of like the Bush variety, like the sort of pious evangelical kind of like moral high ground type social conservatism, but like very like vulgar kind of like contemptuous edgy sort of social conservatism, which we've now seen more like culturally penetrate into the West with like the alt-right and that kind of stuff.
I've seen a lot of that. I mean, I saw a lot of that even in Korea during the Park versus what's his name? There were two conservative forces. Imunbak. It was Park versus Imunbak. Imunbak was a Bush style conservative. Park was a more populist style. They were different religions too. Imunbak was Protestant. Park was Buddhist. Park had a relationship to the prior dictatorship that was pro-American, but it was a completely different faction. And the U.S. population could not, for the life of them, figure out that it was an interconservative. I mean, they weren't really caring either, but it was an interconservative fight,
right.
And it was, and basically, there was also a kind of liberalish peace movement, which did eventually win after Park was discredited, but that was also from the same time period. But I was like, yeah, everyone's like, they're going to win. I'm like, the old people aren't going to vote for that person. And as a person who, like, I'm not super fluent in Korean, but I can follow a conversation. I was like, yeah, it's probably going to be Park, because the young people side with this more liberal person the way you'd expect, but the old people, there's just a lot of them, and they vote. So this is the way it's likely going to go, and it's going to be really close. But they also couldn't, like, Americans couldn't see the policy changes and why the political landscape in Korea itself changed. And I was like, it's a completely different style of conservatism. When I was there, building up to from the Imunbak period to the Park period, there was like stuff on Korean media about U.S. teachers bringing AIDS that was totally fabricated. But it was there to encourage nationalism. And so, and this is in a U.S. ally with good relations with the U.S., but it has its own internal nationalist problem. Well, it's not a problem for the government there. And it's also something that we forget, because everyone's like, oh, Korean identity is really old. I'm like, no, Korean identity is like a product of the 20th century. Like, the language is old, but like the country names, not just North and South Korea, in their own language are not even like, they're not even the same, and they appeal to different distinct empires and stuff like that. That's not known and I've been noticing that in this reporting about the Ukraine. Americans,
my friends would get mad at you for saying the Ukraine, even though
right. Ukraine, like, even that, like, which one do you pick?
That's only been insisted on since, like, I think the late 90s, early 2000s.
Right. It's kind of like Myanmar versus Burma, although that one's clearer. But I have found that Americans, even when they're trying to be anti-imperialist, they're so kind of in their own world and view everything through the lens of their relation to it, that they really don't treat these places like they have agency. And that's not, I mean, we can talk about that. We've talked about it in terms of left, but it's also true for liberals and their weird, the weird hero worship over Ukraine right now, which I'm like, these people are going to be really surprised when Ukrainians hate us in a year and a half, because we are going to sit on our hands to avoid a nuclear war. Like, and frankly, that's not guaranteed to happen, but that's like 99.9% the most likely outcome of all this.
Yeah.
And all these people who are flying yellow and blue right now are going to be totally shocked when if they ever interact with everyday Ukrainians. And I think it might have other effects in Europe because you have 1 million Ukrainian refugees in Poland now.
Yeah, Poland, Romania, Moldova.
Right. And so that's one thing I think people don't understand. Even though you are all flying the yellow and blue, I think a lot of Ukrainians are going to really resent the West at the end of this.
And I mean, like, this is the thing, right? The Antifada was like the question of like, what should we do as leftists? And like, I mean, it's like, I hate like standpoint epistemology, right? But it's like I have like family friends who are being shelled right now, right? So I'm not, I'm certainly not going to call for NATO intervention, partly because we know that it has a good chance of leading to nuclear war. But I'm certainly not going to begrudge all like my friends in Kiev, even like the left-leaning ones who are calling for a no-fly zone, calling for something, because like those people are not thinking about communism; they're thinking about like surviving.
Right. And it's getting more and more desperate there. And also, I think Americans are a little bit blindsided by that because there were biasness in our own reporting. Because I was like, oh, they're reporting, yes, Russia is losing more than we'd expected to in the first 3 days, but we also need to think about historical Russian tactics, which no one in America even knows, where like you throw weaker troops out first, and then the real motherfuckers come in later. And that's for two reasons. Like in a war scenario, right? One reason is it leads to casualties. So when you present this war to your public, you're already invested because you've lost people. U.S. does it too. One thing I used to tell people about understanding, like why is there this weird military base full of green soldiers in South Korea? And I'm like, to get blown up. I'm like, what do you mean? It's to get blown up, so there's American losses. So if North Korea ever was to do anything, we've lost people as an investment, and we have to fight. That's what it's there for. And so you also throw in green soldiers first because they're most likely to die, and they're not a big loss to the army. And people are like, oh, but Russia, like, where's the Russian Air Force? I'm like, the Russian Air Force is sitting by in case we actually do something.
Right.
Like,
they don't need the Air Force for this. And
right.
I mean, their army is concentrated on artillery anyway. So
right, exactly. And so I say this to be like, and so a lot of Americans who read American news sources, even if they're pro-Ukraine, are getting a very, very weird version where they're like, well, why has everything gone to shit in the last 2 days? And I'm like, well, I mean, the Ukraine has a pretty impressive arms industry for a poor country, not going to lie. And its military has actually done better than I think anyone really expected. But that's fucking Russia.
I mean, these these David versus Goliath stories, these like, it's okay. I mean, it's 300, right? It's heroic, but how did 300 end?
Right. Or even even with the United States, they talk about Iraq, and I'm like, yeah, but in the conventional, I mean, yes, we lost the war, but in the conventional war, we run in 30 days.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we broke the government. Now, I also think from the standpoint of, and this is where I'm going to get dark, and I don't mean to, because I know this is very real for you. But I think this might backfire on everyone in a sense, because like if people, like whatever government gets installed after this is not going to be considered legitimate by one side or the other.
No.
And I think you're in hybrid fourth-gen warfare conditions after this. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that bleeds nations. That's Afghanistan. That's and I've heard people say, well, they don't have the population for that in Ukraine. I'm like, no country has the population for it until they have the population for it.
Yeah. Oh no, they do. I mean, this is like, and honestly, if I were more of a tanky, my analysis would be that this is actually the ideal scenario for NATO and America, because now it's like, well, what does Russia broke it. Now they have to buy it. Like, what are they going to do? They can't just install a puppet like pro-Russian president and leave, that guy's going to get overthrown immediately. So now they have to like keep some kind of repressive occupation force. This is the other scary thing about, because a lot of leftists are saying, well, like, the best way to avoid bloodshed right now is just to tell Ukraine to surrender immediately, which, like, in a purely rational calculus, yes, probably. But if you look at Russia's demands, one of them is this open-ended demand of denazification, right? And we've already talked about what Russia means by Nazi, which includes the Jewish president, right? So, there's definitely something very ominous there. I would not be surprised in Russian occupation, basically, like, a large-scale version of what they did in Novorossiya in the Donbass, where, like, not just the government, but civil society would be purged of any, like, prominently pro-Ukrainian elements. And then, not to mention Russia's treatment of, like, LGBT people and all that stuff. But
don't you know that's just a lame Western liberal concern? I've actually had minor arguments with people like this who are like, well, you could, that's just Western liberals. And I'm like, yeah, in one sense, yes. Our concern over marginalized sexuality groups is kind of unique to the West. Sure. But the repression, like in Chechnya, was something else. Like, Moscow didn't deal with that, but Chechnya did. And that's another thing. I've heard people, for example, just throw out, and this is people on the far left in America, which I guess we are both part of, throw out shit like, well, yeah, unfortunately, at this point, we'll throw out shit like, oh, well, the Chechen wars were instigated by the United States. And I'm like, I have never seen anyone provide any substantive evidence of that.
No.
That's a way bigger claim than you telling me that the United States invented Al-Qaeda to mess with stability in the Middle East. Like, there's maybe some trace evidence of that. There's none of that in regards to Chechnya. But that is a talking point in Russia. Yeah. And it's a talking point amongst people who are really influenced by people who are spreading that point of view. Do I think those point of view, like we said, do I think that point of view is common in Russia? My Russian expatriate friends who are in Russia, they're Canadian. I actually probably shouldn't give their nationality. They're not Americans, and they're not. Well, one of them is an American actually, but they're not. They both speak Russian fluently, and even they say they can't give me a good picture of what's going on the ground. They're around people. They're either around like the most educated people in the eastern province where they live, or they're around people in Moscow, and they're like, that's not going to tell you much, right? Yeah. And they'll tell me that, like, even though, but when they read Russian news, they can't make hide a hair of it either. And I will say this: both of them have been very frustrated with American anti-Russian sentiment. Both of them now have been like, this is a line too far. And we have seen this even with like RT reporters. There are RT reporters who step down over this. There's a lot of what I've been surprised when we talk about the Twitter left and all this. There are people who've been involved in this and been willing to take Moscow's side for a long time who have stopped over this.
Yeah.
So that should give you some
silver lining. Yeah, if there's any silver lining to this shit. Yeah, it's that, and I think this is a good moment for people on the left to like really reevaluate their priors.
I mean, yeah. Thank you for coming on. I get what actually. Can I take a second more of your time?
Yeah.
Why were you? I mean, we've talked about the more extreme forms of this, a lot today. I will say, I do think that when we're talking about the super pro-Putin people, they are a minority of a minority of a minority.
Yeah.
They are. But why do you think so many people could not fathom that there was actual troop buildup in Russia, despite like satellite pictures? And and people would say like, well, the U.S. intelligence didn't present their evidence, and I'm like, intelligence forces can't.
Right.
Like,
I mean, but the satellite pictures are all there, and then people are like, well, they had satellite pictures in Iraq, and et cetera. But it was motivated reasoning. It was clear. it was clear that a lot of these people, no amount of evidence would be enough to like sway them, except an actual invasion, which happened, right? And so, yeah, it wasn't just a matter of like, oh, we got the predictions wrong. It's like you deliberately did not want a certain thing to be true because it would undermine kind of, you know, not even your worldview, but your sort of line where your brand as like a left commentator, not you, I mean, just like the hypothetical, the people that we're talking about, like their brand as left commentators were built on like dunking on, you know, Beltway pundits and, you know, Atlantic Council and pro-Western stuff. So the idea that they might be right in a case was like, that's like very damaging to your like, you know, media brand, right? And yeah, so I just mean,
I mean, I do think a lot of ghouls are laughing their way to the bank over this. I really
yeah, they are, but
keep your mouth. I mean, I kept on telling people like, for international solidarity reasons,
yeah,
and for not being an idiot reasons, keep your mouth shut. You don't
always
have
an
to
option.
say,
Right? It's baffling how many people do not realize that it's always an option. People have to like make these statements on Russia and Ukraine, and they're literally, I can tell when people are literally like reading, they're literally repeating the same phrasing that was like in like, you know, some like gray zone article or like a Wikipedia article, and like this is like this is what I mean by. And then people play this game like, oh, who are you talking about? Oh, those tankies, they're just like a fringe minority. They don't exist. You're just finding some weird people on Twitter. Like bullshit. Because this stuff bleeds into like the official DSA International Caucus statement that came out in the run up to the war. It's like, oh, it was completely unproblematic, like anti-war statement. Like, no, it blamed the whole thing. It repeated all of Russia's talking points. It blamed the whole war at NATO escalation. It called the Maidan a far-right fascist coup. Like, and it's obvious that this stuff, yeah, like these people don't consider themselves pro.
Well, I'm gonna say like, I've been doing game theory stuff with online leftists, and this is gonna sound, I'm gonna sound dismissive of a lot of people here, but if you've been identifying yourself, let's say you identified yourself as an occupier, well, that didn't work, so you moved to social democracy, and you didn't listen to all the people who told you that was a fucking waste of time. So like, where do you pivot to both be more extreme and differentiate yourself from not just other leftists, but your own prior position?
Right.
You start picking up traditionally Stalinist talking points. I saw this in 2004 with 2001 to 2004 with International Answer, actually, which turned me to a paleo conservative. And I seriously, I'm being flat out, like, both, because part of it's because I bought some of their rhetoric actually, and then part of it's like, that's ridiculous, like, and that was before I traveled the world, but I'd be like, I know that isn't true. So I moved further and further right from it, and a lot of those people moved right in a different direction, because another thing is there's more than one kind of right wing. So I saw that, then I say it now, and you know what's pernicious about that is I've been trying to tell people, okay, the IC statement, fine, it's a we don't support Putin, but we're gonna repeat all this stuff that we don't really know, and then we're gonna give that's gonna be a statement that can be picked up by like the Spectator, and you know what they say about it? Oh, right. But look how the libs are mad.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, but okay, one, you're still not going to do anything about the fact your NPC and your leadership is like not even holding them to like lines that everyone agrees upon, much less this. Two, you're not going to admit that like this committee is not, the IC committee is not like, might be representative of a vague sense of anti-imperialism in the DSA, but it doesn't know enough. I've been talking about this with their actions in Latin America too. They often do not know enough. And they're like, well, they're dealing with real states. They're not LARPing. I'm like, they got a state-sponsored, or they got a kick-funded thing with state-sponsored access. What are they going to know about what's actually going on in Venezuela? I'm not pro-U.S. interest in Venezuela at all. Like, leave Venezuela the fuck alone. But also, you don't know the complications of local politics, even if you speak Spanish, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is like the one thing, like, it's like, yeah, the left has no power it can't do anything for people in like other states who are like trying to fight their regimes.
They can't do anything in its own country. Like that's my thing. And so that's what I noticed. The focus on international stuff increased as they had no pull over stuff in their own country, and it became obviously so.
Right.
And so
it's like the least you can do in that situation is like keep your mouth shut about stuff you don't know about. And this idea that like any like negative rhetoric towards Russia when it was literally like, massing troops on Ukraine's border and like promoting like insane conspiracy theory shit. If you criticize Russia as an American, the State Department might be listening. They're gonna take that. They're gonna use that as justification. Like how much narcissistic hubris do you have to like believe something like that, right? Or and this, it's like what we have to like submit to self-censorship. We can't like discuss like shit that's openly happening because by some convoluted logic it like feeds a hypothetical NATO war that is not happening and is like 99% not going to happen.
Right. Everything that you could game theory out would say no one's going to be dumb enough to start a nuclear war over this.
Right.
Like, that's the part of this that like drives me up the wall. It's just like, okay, and I still people are like, oh, that statement is awesome. I'm like, they could have just said, the American working class has no interest in this war and left it at that.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing, I said this the other day, like, if the whole Western left just shut up and did nothing but like repost stuff of Russian anti-war protests, that would be like more effective than whatever they're doing right now. Because like those are if you're looking for people to have solidarity with, and if you like, even if you like think Ukrainians are too nationalist or whatever, like those are the people you should have solidarity with right now. People are, and this is not like a protest in the West. This is people are risking like their lives and they're still going out to protest. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that would, and there's this whole misunderstanding of the Chomskyan line that you critique your own country first to you only critique your own country. And I'm like, but you live in a global world in an interconnected system.
Yeah.
Like why is China, for example, like both kind of taking Russia's side and sitting on its hands? You can't critique one side or the other and not figure that out. Like, oh, it has interest in Taiwan, which is against the West, but it also like cannot lose Western trading partners. That would collapse everybody's economy. It's the same reason why frankly, all the sanctions on Russia have been pretty severe, except for that on energy, what they won't put out because they still need like they're leftists don't get that. Their statements on this, in so much that they matter. I mean, I guess the DSAs kind of matter. It's 80,000 people. Although, like I've been telling people, it's declined by 1/5 in less than 6 months. The idea, what I find particularly pernicious about this, all right, is they're releasing these kind of statements, but also domestically, they have been the most milquetoast they've ever been. So this actually, there's actually a perverse incentive where you have like, oh, the IC represents the real feelings of the American left. I'm like, well, the American left doesn't know shit about international politics. They didn't before. They don't now.
I mean, this has its precedent too. Like the CPUSA, like the official Stalinist line in like in the 30s
until literally 4 years ago, frankly, with the CPUSA. Yeah.
It was vote for Democrats, support. Yeah. So. Yeah,
but
and then talk. Well, vote for Democrats at home, and then talk tough about stuff abroad. Basically.
Right. Yeah, that was the whole strategy based on the Popular Front strategy. But long after the Comintern was dissolved, and they weren't even held to it, they just did it for like the entirety of the middle and second half of the 20th century, which also made them irrelevant. Frankly, no one cared about them anymore. They went from being one of the largest, things in the United States, just like the CPA have been, to like a joke. And people blame the Red Scare. The Red Scare is a huge part of it, but it's not the only part of it. And so with the DSA, we're seeing this radicalism on international stuff where you have no effect. You have no effect. Because if you guys don't have effect on domestic policy with your three things, you sure as hell don't have effect on international policy. So your statement means what at all? And I've been trying to tell people that, and I get so much pushback.
I mean, like, well, if it does have any effect, like I said before, it's like, to alienate any left-leaning people in the countries that you're talking about, because you're basically like repeating the rhetoric of their oppressive regime. So yeah, I mean, it makes any kind of future where there's international solidarity on the left even more unlikely than it already is, right? So
yeah, and these are people who like always talk about the Kautsky problem and war credits and all that, and I'm like, well, but okay, you realize that like revolutionary defeatism meant both sides got defeated somehow, and actually in the case of Russia versus Germany, that happened.
Yeah,
both, but that's not how it works out 90% of the time in history, and this won't be it either. And I have thought it was irresponsible. Like, it's one thing that like try to understand at least the rhetoric around NATO. There's people who like, I think there's some way to feel like it is sincere or not. The other thing I will say about the IC statement is, according to people involved in the international community, that the original statement was even more inflammatory than the one that was released modified by the MPC. So I'm like, well, what were you guys really saying? Like, critical support for Comrade Putin? Like,
well, I remember when they this was like earlier on when they there was something where they were supposed to release a statement. No, it was like the national meeting, right? When they were drafting a statement of principles, and some people wanted to put in opposition to all imperialism, and that got shut down, and because people were insisting on only putting opposition to U.S. imperialism. Is that right? Is that what ended up happening?
I don't know. I think so, but I
can't.
I think
right.
I mean, I'm not in the DSA. I follow this stuff because I follow I'm kind of a reporter on American left issues, but if I'm frank, I find all this to be somewhat of a morbid joke, and a morbid joke that I increasingly think, like, on one hand, no, whether or not you put a Russian or Ukrainian flag on your stupid Twitter profile doesn't fucking matter. On the other hand, I am worried about, like, you guys are making the ghouls look good. You are actively you're not even, like, the DSA statement wasn't even agitprop for their side. It was immediately seized on by hawkish liberals as proof that the socialists are unpatriotic. Okay, we are unpatriotic, fine, but it's like you didn't have to do that. Right. And it seems like what motivated you to do that is actually kind of internal to the DSA, and this kind of posturing about foreign policy and anti-imperialism, so no one accuses you of being a CIA operative, which I hate to tell you.
Yeah, it's cloud chasing among, like, your little clique, basically. It's not it's not really actually externally oriented at all.
But it does have effects in the larger world in a way that, like, you being an idiot as an individual doesn't. Right. And I think the other thing that people don't realize is there's a real sense in which, like, the right-wing people, and right-wing by that we mean like social democrats who are super just progressives, in the DSA also benefit from these coteries existing, because now you have this radical statement, but they can continue supporting AOC and Jamal Bowman, etc., even though they're releasing these kind of statements. It's like it's a way to. It's like if I was say a Democratic Party operative, is kind of brilliant. I got all the people who I think are bad PR. I can use them for bad PR, but they're also still supporting my candidates anyway.
Yeah.
Like, on every level, not just on the international level, it's dumb. And I can't I got pushback from that in all corners. It wasn't just from, like, DSA people or the people who were talking about taking extreme stances. There were people who were like, why are you so mad about that statement? Oh, you're just a lib. And I'm like, I'm not just a lib. I actually, like, I think some of the claims of the Russian security apparatus are even rational. But I know how expanding major states work. right? Like they do certain things. Like you cannot assume that they are moral actors ever. And
Right.
that that includes us. And we get that about our own state because we realize that like our values aren't reflected in the U.S. government. But why do they think that's true everywhere? Like they not only are these places seen as not having agency.
It's just weird to hear leftists use terms like justifiable security concerns, like justifiable according to what like ethos or what like if we're against nation states to begin with, what is
But
this
the thing is, they're not. Like right, they might say, "Oh, well, you're a cynical anarchist. You're not good, mature Marxist like me, who believes in nation states." And I'm just like the workers of the world have no country. Communist Manifesto.
Yeah, if Russia has legitimate security concerns, then the U.S. and NATO have legitimate security concerns, right? It cuts both ways. Like either we're against shit or it's like you're just like rooting for the underdog because you want some kind of you want some kind of parity. You want multiple NATOs facing off against each other, then that you think that world is going to be somehow more peaceful. Like, give me a break.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a good place in it because that's kind of a rant. But I'm with you. It was me ranting. I've been surprised at how naive people are.
Yeah.
Like, and I've also been like this idea that we live in a world of campism where it's not even like campus for China because like, okay, they have socialism in their constitution or something, even though they're like, the first largest capitalist producer in the world. But fine, whatever. You can I can see how you get there. This I don't see how you get there. I'm like, because Putin said one thing nice about Stalin once, even though he totally shit on Lenin when we said it. Like in that speech, you see contempt coming out of him about decommunization and this, that, and the other. It's wild that people are taking this as somehow left wing. Anyway, all right. Thank you for coming on. I'll release this very soon.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, let me know.
All right. Take care.